He was one of the founding scholars of industrial relations in Australia and brought to it a keen economic mind and a public policy interest.
He was, I think, an outstanding member of the conciliation and arbitration system.
Well, I would say he made a great professional contribution both at university and subsequently as a public servant, but more importantly, I think probably later on in the Arbitration Commission.
I can't think of anyone else who's made a broader, deeper contribution to public life than Joe, across the range of things he's been engaged in. He's been both an outstanding academic and he's made a substantial practical contribution to the field. I think he's just beyond compare.
Well, Joe was the first economist, industrial relations academic to be appointed to the Commission, and that gave him an authority and a knowledge which assisted the Commission greatly.
He was always very conscious of the different sides of an argument, the different perspectives, so he was a bit of a born arbitrator anyway.
Bob Hawke, who wasn't generally inclined to make positive attributions to other people, credited Joe with much of the thinking behind the Accord, which was also influenced by Swedish and Scandinavian approaches and so on.
When we were kids, my brother and sister and I knew very little about our father's job. And when we asked him what he did for a living, he told us he was a window cleaner. And we said to him, well, what about this office you seem to have at Melbourne University? And he said, there's a lot of windows there. It's an important job, and of course they give me an office.
But he came here, of course, as a student in 1941. His father persuaded him to study accountancy. He did his degree and then he worked for an accountancy firm, but he found it boring. And he was offered a tutorship in economics, and he took that, and then economics. That became his lifelong interest.
He was a great intellectual, and he really was very committed to the equity of the industrial relations system in many ways, and was good at identifying problems and ways that they could be addressed.
And he was a great mentor to the young labour specialists and management people in general. They respected him enormously.
Well, Joe was one of the most humane, engaging and welcoming, inviting person that you're likely to meet. He had lovely values. He was really concerned about the well-being of people, including people who were voiceless themselves.
Into his early 90s, he was on campus contributing. I could see he was always at University House engaging with people, and I thought, what a marvellous role model for a public intellectual and just an incredibly generous, decent person.
He took an interest in my research and he gave me lots of encouragement to push ahead and get it finished. At the time, I had no idea of the many distinguished contributions he had already made in industrial relations. All I knew was that he was the incredibly polite and friendly person who was still doing his own research after retirement.
He had a very good sense of humour, and we were preparing a skit for one of the AIRAN's conferences, and the idea behind the skit was that we gave him a very straight set of questions about industrial relations and people and so forth. And then the plan was that there'd be a glitch in the presentation of that. So he did all the filming of this. He agreed to having the glitch and everything. And at the end, a completely different set of questions were asked, and his straight industrial relations answers were provided. He was willing to do that, even though it made him look crazy.
You really knew that if somebody had upset him, because he would describe them as a twerp.
That was as strong as his language.
Yeah. The thing I really admired about Joe
was his willingness to change his mind. And you presented him a good argument, he would go along with it.
And at the age of 95 or whatever he was making soup and turning on, dinners and lunches and things so that he could gather around. Now, he'd never cooked, he'd supervised.
And I once asked him why he was learning more cookery in his last few years. And he said, because I love to invite people round for dinner or lunch and I need to have more recipes.
He had a fantastic cellar, so you would always get brilliant wine at Joe's place. He also knew a huge amount about Australian art and had the most extraordinary collection of art in his house.
And then he would phone me up, "Oh, Ian, why don't we buy 6 bottles of this? I've just seen this, looks very good,
He was always happy to meet with any student or colleague who was having any sort of problem, and that might range from an understanding of economic theory through to marital problems.
I wrote a book which was 800 pages long, and I needed to get critical comments in order to make it better than I left it. And it's very hard to ask somebody to read 800 pages. I mentioned to Joe that I was having this problem, and he said, "I'll do it," and he did. And his comments came back in 2 weeks or so, and I adopted almost everything that he proposed. And then he came across to Adelaide for the launch of the book, and everybody appreciated that.
We had kids, we had twins, they were premature and they were in hospital for a period of time. He and Golda were enormously supportive, to the point where they bought us a year's supply of nappies for twins so that we could get through that first year.
He was very soft-spoken and quiet, but behind that was an absolute belief in himself, and clearly thought out position on almost everything that you could raise. So he was, although you might at first glance think he was, a bit wishy-washy, and that was not the position at all. I mean, his voice was, in a sense, misleading. He was much more sort of sure of himself than it seemed at first.
He spent a lot of his early years in Indonesia, and he pursued that concern for Indonesia, and in fact went with McMahon Ball in 1945 when Australia was trying to contribute to resolution of the conflict between the Netherlands and the Indonesian nationalists. And he helped write the report, and the Labor government at the time accepted the Indonesian nationalists' drive for independence, and that owed something to McMahon Ball and Joe's report. And he continued to pursue that interest right to the end.
Well, he did tell me once that he used to lecture to a very large crowd at Monash doing Economics 1, packed lecture theatre, but always in one of the front rows there was a student reading a newspaper, and he got a little bit irritated about it, and he asked the student why he was reading the newspaper, and this extremely embarrassed student said, "I'm actually waiting for the lecture after this, which is even more crowded, so I'd like to get a front seat by coming to yours."
He was still driving until a few weeks before he died, which scared the living hell out of me.
We came across these recordings of Mahler's symphonies by Benjamin Zander, an American conductor. And the thing about these recordings was that Zander would have on one CD the symphony, but on another CD he would have a commentary and discussion. And these were really quite good. So then one day Joe said to me, he said, "I've written to Zander asking him." I asked him, "When are you going to do Mahler's Second Symphony? Because that's my favourite. And I should point out, I'm very old. And so I don't have much time left. So you better get a move on."
Russell Lansbury had contacted him in February of that year. I think the event was in November, saying, "Joe, we wanted to have this event for you to mark your contribution." And as Joe said during the speech, that he thought that was very optimistic of Russell because he had given up buying green bananas at that stage.
He had this huge career over a long period of time, and he was respected by all sorts of people. I mean, you know, Bob Hawke, etc. He just built this large persona. But think about it. There was none of the hype or the salesmanship that goes with people in the present era. He was just kind of Joe.
I'd just say it was an honour to know him, and a privilege indeed to spend so much time with him in his latter years.